I'm going to try and avoid too much repetition. A lot of what the previous speaker said I absolutely agree with, and I'm going to try and avoid repeating too much of that. But I think the first thing we have to grasp in talking about crop protection is that the true value of it is completely underestimated. And one reason for that is that you and I have lived through a generation when we were never considered the prospect of food shortages. We really lived through an era when the problem was an oversupply of food from the perspective of Europe. And lots of policies arose from that. The cost of storing these surpluses, the cost to the public of apparently wasting money, all fed through to politicians, fed through to civil servants. And we saw during the last 25 years or so in Europe really a mindset which I call the second era in agriculture. If you like, the first era was the post-war era when we did want to produce more food. Success of that led to a second era starting late 1980s, early 1990s, when really politicians across Europe said we've got to curb production. They weren't therefore interested or very interested in efficiency. They weren't very interested in productivity. On the other hand, they were politically constrained. They could not just remove support from farming. So they switched attention. They said, really, farmers are custodians of the countryside. We are pumping money into agriculture in order to protect the countryside. And a lot of unfortunate byproducts followed from that. That gave those who were of that view the chance to talk against the industrialization of farming. Quite a ridiculous viewpoint if you think about it, when industrialization of farming has brought all the benefits it has for the farming industry, for those who consume the food processing industries, and indeed for consumers in general. But the whole tide turned against efficiency, competitiveness, and productivity in farming. We could only do that, of course, because everyone was blinded to the fact that what was actually going on was food was getting cheaper. So no one was getting worried about it. We could talk about, other needs for farming, pretend that our money was going to produce in a better countryside, pretend that that's the real reason we were pumping money in. What I ask you happens if we are now to enter a new era when perhaps that is being reversed. When the mindset that said we have plenty of food, the mindset that said we don't really need to bother too much about farming, we certainly don't need to put too much money into research in this industry. What happens once it begins to dawn on politicians that the world is changing out of all recognition? I would say we are entering a third era. You've had it outlined to you, so I'm not going to dwell on it too much here. But essentially, after a generation of falling real food prices, you're in for a period of years when, at the very least, food prices are not going to fall in real terms. And of course, that is compounded in the short run by economic slowdown. If you think of the affordability of food as being essentially the price of food relative to the growth of consumers' expenditure, we're in for some difficult years in the years ahead. And of course, politicians are very tuned to the cost of living, and in particular, the cost of food. They have to be, and they will be looking for solutions to this problem. And one of the things I'm going to try and demonstrate in the time available to me here is that tucked away here in the heart of all this are plant protection products. Central to the success of the agricultural industry over the last 30, 40 years, central to the benefits that populations have gained from the success of more efficient, cheaper food production, central to the wider benefits to society that flow from that are those little things called plant protection products. So the issue for me is quite simply, if you take those away, if you start to restrict them, that would be bad in good times. If you want to restrict them, take them away in times when food prices are likely to be rising, when the pressures on feeding people are increasing, then it borders almost on insanity. Certainly highly questionable approach to the problem. Here, I don't want to repeat too much of what is said before. Let me just say this. We talk about population growth, and most forecasts say that the world's population will reach about 9.2 billion by 2050. And yes, that's going to mean more mouths and more people wishing to eat food, obviously. But you miss a trick if you think that's the important thing. It's this rapid pace of development, particularly in Asia and Latin America, that I think has taken people somewhat by surprise. When people live on $1 a day or $2 a day, their diets are very basic. As development leads to their income per day going $4, $5, $6, $7, $8 a day, so their diets change. And in particular, they want to consume more meat, they want to consume more dairy products, and more fresh fruit and vegetables. And it's that effect, particularly in Asia, where half the world's population live, which is driving up the demand for food and will continue to drive up the demand for food in the foreseeable future. So it's not only population growth, it's this much greater demand coming from development. You can add to that urbanization. Past the point, I think, or they estimate last year, where a greater proportion of the world's population is living in urban areas than is living in rural areas, and those two lines on a graph are going to widen steadily from now on. As people live in urban areas, so we need much more integrated food chains, you need to change your whole approach, really, for those populations in terms of supplying them with food. What about the supply side? Well, you've just been through all of these, but let's just throw in a few figures for you. Agriculture uses more than half of the world's supply of fresh water. If you go to countries like India, which people hold up as being a great success in terms of the Green Revolution in the 1960s, it's running short of water. Large parts of the world are running short of water. Large parts of the world are going to find it difficult, even with current technology, to maintain a level of production, while at the same time demand for food is going up. You've been told about the relationship between fuel prices or energy prices and agricultural costs, particularly fertilizer prices, and you may recently have seen reports in the press of BH Billiton making a bid for Phosphate Corporation in Canada. They obviously worked out, but a number of people have worked out, in the future demand for these products is going to be a great deal higher than it is today, and that makes it worthwhile bidding for these sort of huge sums of money. And climate change. Crops, which I will argue are central to the whole agricultural system, they do not like extremes of weather. And while we cannot be certain at all as to just exactly how climate change will pan out, it does appear that more extreme weather is going to be part of it. So at the same time that demand is increasing rapidly, I think consensus of academic opinion is that demand is going to double between now and 2050. That takes a little bit of thinking about. It means that, from time immemorial up to now, we've got to do it all again in just the next 40 years. And we've got to do it with water shortages, rising energy prices, climate change, and without the benefit, really, of a great deal more land. Slight different approach on this demand and supply issue, because I'm not here just to talk about farming or whatever. Food chains. Just think about food companies. Think about Europe. Food manufacturing sector is the largest manufacturing sector in Europe. It's a large employer of labour, and it's a great generator of economic activity. The effects of what I'm talking about are going to change the risk profile for these businesses. Up to now, they've looked at risks in terms of things like transparency, things like consumer sentiment, etc. But they haven't really had to worry about their raw material supply. far as they were concerned, there was a plentiful supply of food. They could treat the basic agricultural suppliers in a way that one might if there was an oversupply. What is changing, and what they are realising, is that the risks have moved upstream. In the years ahead, their concern is going to be getting the quantity of the quality of the products they need to keep their businesses going. And this is going to lead to changed behaviour on their part. We saw food prices rise very rapidly in 2007, 2008. And of course, if one wasn't aware of the background here, you might say, well, this is typical of the industry. You get these spikes in food prices every so often, and we shouldn't perhaps worry too much about it, because high prices bring forward additional production, and certainly they did. We saw 2 world record harvests following the spike in cereal prices back in 2008. But then we should, if history repeated itself, we should have waited another 10 years for the next one. But it's upon us already. And prices never went back to where they were. If you look at grain prices today, if you look at agricultural prices today, they're way above where they were in 2007. Something like 25% up on where they were, and they are now rising rapidly again. It all adds a great deal of support to the view that we've entered a new third era, that we're entering an era of much higher prices and much more volatile prices. Much greater risks now placed in the food system than there were. We're rich in this part of the world. In truth, we'll probably never be short of food. We'll just have to pay a lot more for it. Sounds rather trite, of course, you know, but if you're paying a lot more for your food, what are you spending less on? Because someone, somewhere, is going to suffer as a result of paying a lot more for your food. And if we do look a little wider, and perhaps in my old age I'm getting a little cynical, I think what really matters to our politicians is what happens here, first and foremost, but where we can talk about higher food prices. In many parts of the world, what we're talking about is going to be increased malnutrition, hunger, and even starvation. So, central message, which you've already had today, is that we are moving into an era when the growth of demand in the world is outstripping the world's ability to supply. One of the solutions, which I've seen put forward by many eminent and not so eminent people, is that really what people should be doing is not eating so much meat. Perhaps we would solve this problem if we all became vegetarians. I really think it's patronising or insulting in the extreme to say to people who are struggling to achieve our living standards in many parts of the world, who have, look forward to the day when they might enjoy the sort of diets that we enjoy, and we at the same time are telling them, well, I'm sorry, we don't think you should be able